It's just past midnight on Saturday, May 2, 2026, and an Airbus A320 is touching down in Dallas, Texas. The 175 passengers on board flight NK-1833 have no idea they are participating in a grim milestone. This is the final flight Spirit Airlines will ever operate. By sunrise, the 34-year-old American carrier will permanently close its doors. They will cancel all future flights, lay off their entire staff, and liquidate every asset they own. Spirit's collapse was triggered by an immediate, uncontrollable surge in the price of the liquid that kept their fleet in the air. This graph tracks the global price of jet fuel over the last few months. In late February, a barrel cost about $99, but by early April, the price rockets past $209. An operating expense doubling in a matter of weeks will bankrupt almost any business. But to understand why an American budget airline was destroyed so quickly, we have to trace that missing fuel back to a maritime blockade thousands of miles away. The root of this collapse is a U.S.-Israeli conflict with Iran that has resulted in the total closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Looking at a map of the region, the severity of the blockade becomes obvious. A massive percentage of the world's refined energy products is now physically trapped inside the Persian Gulf, completely cut off from global markets. This geography isolates some of the most critical energy suppliers on Earth. Kuwait, for instance, is the second largest exporter of jet fuel in the world, and their outgoing shipments have effectively dropped to zero. The immediate victim of this freeze is Europe. After pivoting away from Russian energy a few years ago, European nations began relying heavily on the Middle East, drawing roughly 60% of their jet fuel from the Gulf. The finality of this cutoff is stark. When a Libyan-flagged tanker named the Matiga arrived in the UK on April 7th, it delivered the absolute last known shipment of jet fuel to escape the region. Fatih Birol, the executive director of the International Energy Agency, has warned that European stockpiles are now critically low. At current consumption rates, the continent has only about 3 weeks of fuel left in its reserves. The countdown has forced a desperate global scramble to find a replacement supplier before the tanks run completely dry. The logical move for a desperate continent is to look east. Asia holds the largest share of global refining capacity, so buyers naturally assume these nations can simply step up and manufacture the missing jet fuel. Refining giants in countries like South Korea rely on the Middle East for 70% of their raw crude oil. This flowchart illustrates the dual-shock nature of the crisis. First, the direct pipeline of refined jet fuel to Europe is severed. Second, the raw ingredients required to manufacture that fuel in Asia are cut off at the exact same choke point. With production paralyzed, a cascading panic sets in. Major producers like China are hoarding remaining domestic fuel supplies and heavily restricting exports. The scramble for whatever fuel remains is causing chaos at sea. Right now, cargo ships currently mid-voyage are abruptly changing their destinations, carving sharp turns across the open ocean to deliver their cargo to whichever nation is willing to pay the highest price. The highly interconnected nature of global energy means a single localized maritime blockade instantly triggers a worldwide bidding war for a rapidly vanishing resource. This macroeconomic squeeze quickly bleeds down into the daily operations of commercial aviation. For any airline, fuel is an inescapable necessity, ranking as their second largest operational expense right behind labor. A standard narrow-body commercial jet burns about 800 gallons of fuel every single hour it stays in the air. In a healthy market, fuel commands 25 to 30% of an airline's budget. The math is incredibly rigid. When that expense suddenly doubles, it violently consumes the profit margin, forcing profitable routes into a heavy deficit. The global aviation industry is now facing a brutal ultimatum. Carriers must either absorb these colossal losses and face immediate bankruptcy, or pass the massive price hike directly onto their customers. Global flight schedules depend on the steady flow of fuel through specific maritime choke points. When a single waterway in the Middle East closes, the economics of air travel change overnight, pricing out the everyday path. Look at this chart comparing a Delta flight from New York to Los Angeles. In late February, you could book this trip for $128. By late March, that exact same route spiked to $329. That is a 157% jump in under a month. This sudden price shock traces back to a geopolitical conflict involving Iran that led to the sudden closure of the Strait of Hormuz. The immediate market reaction to that closure hit the aviation industry like we are looking at a scenario where global jet fuel prices didn't tick up 10 or 20%, they doubled overnight. This creates an immediate crisis for airlines because there's a strict price ceiling on what travelers will accept. If an airline passes 100% of those doubled fuel costs directly to passengers, ticket prices become unaffordable and demand completely collapses. Budget airlines face the most severe threat here. Their entire business model relies on highly price-sensitive customers, meaning they have almost zero room to raise base fares without alienating their core demographic. The carriers are trapped in an impossible math equation. They have to choose between absorbing massive operational losses on every flight or pricing their own customers out of the sky. Faced with those brutal economics, airlines are pulling their first major lever, grounding flights entirely. If they can't sell seats at a price that covers the new cost of fuel, they simply stop flying the route. The scale of these cuts is massive. Across the global network, carriers quietly removed 2 million available seats and canceled 12,000 flights in the month of May alone. International routes to Asia are facing particular logistical terror. Analysts report that European airlines are afraid to send planes eastward, terrified they will be stranded overseas at airports that simply don't have enough regional jet fuel for the return trip. To keep the business afloat, airlines are aggressively shrinking their global footprint, leaving passengers to fight over a rapidly diminishing pool of available seats. The second survival lever targets the passenger indirectly. Carriers are trying to keep the advertised base fare looking low, while quietly shifting the massive fuel burden onto travelers through microtransactions. We are seeing an industry-wide explosion in extra fees. The costs for checked bags, carry-ons, seat selection, and heavy penalties for weight overages are steadily rising. The consumer still foots the bill for the global fuel crisis. The extraction is just happening through a dozen small financial cuts before you board, rather than a single massive shock when you search for a ticket. Yet, not every airline is bleeding cash at the same rate. Delta is facing $2 billion in extra fuel costs this year, and United Airlines warned they could take an $11 billion hit. But across the Atlantic, European rivals like Lufthansa are navigating the exact same crisis with relative stability. The dividing line between surviving this shock and losing billions comes down to a specific financial strategy called fuel hedging. This chart illustrates how hedging works. Airlines enter into contracts to buy future fuel deliveries at a guaranteed set price. Even if the volatile global market skyrockets above it, the airline's contracted price stays perfectly flat. Lufthansa survived because they locked in 80% of their 2026 fuel requirements years in advance. They are only exposed to these soaring market prices on the remaining 20% of the fuel they actually need. The major American carriers made a calculated gamble and lost. They abandoned their hedging strategies entirely, betting that global oil prices would naturally decline over time. Because executives decided to chase short-term savings by dropping those contracts, U.S. airlines entered this geopolitical shock with absolutely zero financial armor. The Director General of IATA has made it clear that a quick resolution to the conflict won't save the summer travel season. Even if the Strait of Hormuz reopens tomorrow, the global aviation network will take months to recover. The first major bottleneck keeping the supply chain frozen is logistical. Hundreds of massive fuel tankers are currently trapped in a massive traffic jam in the Arabian Gulf. Second, the region's refining infrastructure sustained severe physical damage. Repairing these highly specialized facilities requires time and resources the market currently does not have. Finally, the global aviation fuel reserves were heavily depleted during the initial supply shock. Rebuilding those stockpiles is a slow, methodical process that cannot be rushed. This overlapping structural damage guarantees an incredibly difficult few months for aviation. The era of cheap, easily accessible flights is on pause, regardless of what happens next in the Middle East. Have you flown recently and noticed any bizarre fee increases or massive jumps in your ticket price?